everyone, I'm Ines and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I'm going to be sharing a wrap-up review of my reading during Victober 2017. Victober is a month-long celebration of all things Victorian literature, hosted by Katie from Books and Thins, Kate from Kate Howe, Ange from Beyond the Pages, and Lucy from Lucy the Reader. Last year I didn't discover Victober until about halfway through, but I still managed to read Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens and The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And ever since, I've been eagerly anticipating the return of Victober and hoping that this year I would be able to fully participate. There were 5 prompts or challenges set out by the hosts this year. The first is to read a Victorian book by a Scottish, Irish, or Welsh author. The second is to read a lesser-known Victorian book. The third is to read a supernatural Victorian book. The fourth is to read a Victorian book that someone has recommended to you. And the fifth is to read a Victorian book by a female author. So, without further ado, I'll get into the 4 books that I ended up reading during Victober 2017. The first book that I read for Victober was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I was absolutely captivated by this book, and it definitely deserved a 5-star rating in my opinion. And it also fits the challenge to read a Victorian book by a female author, because obviously Anne Bronte is a woman. I had read Jane Eyre earlier this year, and absolutely loved the first half, but I found the second half and the ending to be a bit of a letdown, and I wished, well, I won't give spoilers, but I wish since it ended up differently than how they did. And I had heard that Anne Bronte had a more realistic writing style than her 2 other sisters, so I thought that I would try The Tenant of Wildfell Hall as my next Bronte novel to see how it suited me, and I thought it was just beautiful from start to finish. I totally enjoyed my reading experience. I found it to be a very atmospheric and autumnal read, and I got completely swept away into the story. And I felt like I was right there on the windswept moors and all the spooky, deserted manor houses. So I definitely would recommend The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, especially if you've read Jane Eyre and you didn't enjoy it. There were parts of Jane Eyre that you found to be problematic or that impeded your enjoyment. I would definitely recommend checking out Anne Bronte as an alternative. My second Victober book was The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was another 5-star read for me and also fulfilled 2 of the Victober challenges, as Stevenson is a Scottish author, and there were also a few supernatural elements to the plot. Because this book is iconic and is absorbed into society's cultural psyche, I already knew the basics of the storyline, but I still found it to be a very engaging plot, and it didn't impede my enjoyment of the book whatsoever. And I was still surprised that the point of view was from an outside observer, as I had somehow always imagined that it was narrated by the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character, so that was something that surprised me, and I definitely really enjoyed the atmosphere of the book. It felt kind of claustrophobic, like you felt like you were right there in the streets of London with this character trying to unravel the mystery of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The third book that I read during Victober was Miss Marjoribanks by Margaret Oliphant. This book fulfills the challenge to read a lesser-known Victorian book, and it's also written by a female author, so again it ticks off 2 of the challenges for Victober. This book was read as part of a read-along Goodreads group hosted by the hosts of Victober, so it was neat to be able to share and read opinions of other people in the Goodreads group as I read along. That being said, it wasn't a particularly captivating read for me, and I ended up rating it 3 stars, as I found some parts of it I really enjoyed, and then other parts kind of dragged on, and I felt like when I put it down, I wasn't immediately wanting to go back into it. I would pick something else up over it. Going into this, I had heard Margaret Oliphant's writing style being compared to Jane Austen, and this book in particular being compared to Emma, which I had read this summer and really enjoyed, so I was really looking forward to it. However, in my opinion, when I was comparing Margaret Oliphant and Jane Austen, I felt like this book lacked the emotional depth of a lot of Austen's writing, and that I felt like I was missing something, like I never really got below the surface level with characters' emotions or motivations, and there was just something missing that didn't make it completely captivating for me. That being said, it was definitely an enjoyable story. Like the general storyline and plot were interesting, and I found parts of it funny, it just didn't quite hold up to Austen as I was hoping. The last book that I read for Victober was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This was a perfect book to read in the lead up to Halloween, as it's full of lots of spooky and unsettling scenes, and it was a solid 4-star read for me. This book managed to meet 3 of the challenges. Oscar Wilde is an Irish writer. The book definitely has a lot of supernatural and gothic elements, and it's also one of my sister's absolute favorite books, so it's also a Victorian book that someone has recommended to me many, many times, and I'm finally just now getting around to reading it during Victober. I'd seen a movie adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray a few years ago, but I'd managed somehow to forget most of it, or maybe the adaptation that I watched wasn't very accurate to the story, because I found that I was still being surprised by a lot of the twists and turns to the narrative. This is a book that I really wish I'd had a chance to study at school, as I felt like the text was really rich in literary devices, and I'm sure I missed a lot of the deeper meaning to the novel, so it's definitely one that I would want to reread in the future, maybe after reading some more literary critique analysis of the story. The only reason this wasn't a 5-star read for me was that I found that some of Lord Henry's discussions were a little too philosophical / pseudo-intellectual / mansplainy, which I know is part of his detestable character, but I felt like it still sometimes took me out of the novel in a way. It was especially interesting to read The Picture of Dorian Gray and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde within the same month, because Stevenson and Wilde are dealing with very similar issues throughout both novels, particularly the idea of double identities and sin being somehow tangibly visible in the exterior characteristics of an individual. So anyway, those are the 4 Victorian novels that I read during Victober this year. A big thanks to all the wonderful hosts for making it such an enjoyable month of reading these great classic books, and I can't wait to participate again next year. As I've been watching everyone's Victober videos, I've been making a mental TBR for next year, and I already have a huge list of Victorian books that I'm interested in diving into next year, and I'm sure some of them I'll get to even sooner because I just can't wait. Thanks for watching, and until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book.